Hello, everybody. My name is Zojalyx, and welcome back to another episode of the Countertop. First of all, want to apologize for this camera quality. I'm not at my regular computer right now, and so I am recording off of my laptop, which has crappy webcam. So, where we last left off, we talked about the founding of Bumbleberg and Obadiah Bumbley. But now, this is where we're going to get into the nitty gritty, the modern day, the Larryboy becomes Larryboy section. And wow, that sounded really dumb. Larry the Cucumber. So we're fast forwarding about 200 and something years, basically just under 300 years, to the time where Larry showed that he was worthy to take up the mantle of Larryboy. So, without further ado, let's dive into it. So, we know that Larry's father is an astronaut, and that is something that he picks up after he retires the mantle of Larryboy. But before he was able to retire the mantle of Larryboy, he had to decide which one of his four sons, Bob, Steve, Mark, Larry, were going to be the next Larryboy. During this time, the family was living in the city of Bumbleberg, and throughout their time living there, they often would go and visit their good friend Junior Asparagus, who lived in the small town of Dingletown. Now, you're probably wondering where this all fits in. It comes in a wonderful film, The Toy That Saved Christmas. This is where Larry proves that he is worthy of picking up the mantle of Larryboy. Let's say at this point, Larry is is really young, kind of like, I'd say 16 to 17 years old, maybe even younger than that, when he meets Buzzsaw Louie with Bob and Junior. They sneak back into Mr. Nezer's factory and share the good news of Christmas, as we would see in the episode. But I think there was more going on here. So what we know is that everybody wanted the Buzzsaw Louie toy. And so Mr. Nezer sets it up to have everybody want to get a Buzzsaw Louie. But there was secretly something else going on, because why else would you create a toy with a fully functioning buzzsaw? And so what happens is Mr. Nezer creates Buzzsaw Louie with this artificial intelligence that was programmed to, when a certain number of Buzzsaw Louies were distributed, were going to be activated, thus creating this like robot army for Mr. Nezer to take over the world. Except for that one Buzzsaw Louie that warns them of what happens. And so in the show, you see them sneak into the factory to tell the people the good news of Christmas. But in the actual events, they sneak in to warn them about the incoming Buzzsaw Louie invasion. And thus, then, they thwart it by destroying all the other Buzzsaw Louies. Mr. Nezer gets arrested, his factory gets shut down, all that kind of stuff. Okay? And Larry's dad sees that and notices that Larry went above and beyond what he was required to do. He sacrificed a lot. Without any training or anything like that, he was willing to sacrifice himself, his freedom, his life, in order to save the world from the impending Buzzsaw Louie invasion. And that stuck out to him. That made him realize that Larry was different than his three other brothers. And so, Larry's dad pulls him aside and talks to him about it, tells him about the mantle of Larryboy, tells him about it, and tells him that he is worthy to take it up. And thus he begins training. He trains over and over and over and over and over before he's ready. And then eventually, when it becomes time, Larry then takes up the mantle of Larryboy, and his father becomes an astronaut. And at this point, you're probably wondering how this all makes sense. But how this works out is when you get to specifically the first major supervillain in the VeggieTales series, Larryboy and the Fib from Outer Space. By that point, they already have an established relationship with Larryboy. They have the Larry signal. They have this whole alerting Larryboy system in case there's an impending alien invasion, all that kind of stuff. And so, by the time Larry gets ready to deal with the Fib from Outer Space, he just has to see the signal, spring into action, and he's good. And in the same instance that this happens with Larry the Cucumber, their family decide to keep an eye on the Asparagus family. They do that because then later on throughout Larry's career, Junior gets adopted into the League of Incredible Vegetables under the name Ricochet. And the reason why that this is important that they started looking at him back then is because Junior is like super young by the time he becomes Ricochet. He's like maybe 7 or 8 years old. So I think that actually in Dingletown, you're actually looking at Dad Asparagus, and Larry, Bob, and Dad Asparagus have this really buddy buddy connection with all this. Dad Asparagus being the oldest, and then they all grow up and Larry explains what's going on when Junior becomes Ricochet. Because Dad Asparagus initially turns down the role of Ricochet, but then Larry knows that they need him, and thus he gets adopted in as Ricochet. Thus, then Bob, who lives out in Pugsleyville, becomes Thingamabob. And throughout this period of time, between Larryboy and the Fifth from Outer Space and the League of Incredible Vegetables, there are more people getting adopted into the League through like Vogue and Escape. They get moved in as more family relations get picked up, and eventually then that stems on to more and more stuff like that, if that makes sense. Until eventually you get what we then have as the League of Incredible Vegetables. And it all starts from when Larry gets the mantle. And then you're probably also wondering, okay, but what about the cartoon adventures of Larryboy? Where does that all fit in? So as we know, in Larryboy and the Fifth from Outer Space, which is here at the beginning of the timeline. Not at the beginning of the timeline, but Larryboy and the Fifth from Outer Space is the first supervillain that Larry the Cucumber deals with. And in that, you know that Alfred creates he puts in the plane, all the different modes of the Larry Mobile. And you know that in the cartoon adventures of Larryboy, those are already in. And also, it wouldn't make sense for Larry to then become Larryboy, working in the show business in VeggieTales to help maintain his cover, and then suddenly become a janitor at the Daily Bumble. None of that makes sense. But as we know, is throughout time, shows come and go. So with that going in, you then have eventually Larry the Cucumber and Bob the Tomato retire VeggieTales. And around the same time, because they're old, all that kind of stuff. And around the same time, Larry retires the mantle of Larryboy to then his son. Alfred then has a son named Archie. And this is where you get to where the cartoon adventures of Larryboy actually are. They take place following the adventures of the son of the Larry the Cucumber that we know. And so then Bob, with his money and everything, his son then starts the Daily Bumble and becomes chief editor. And then Larry's son only becomes janitor to kind of do this like family favor kind of thingamajigger, but doesn't actually take up the mantle of Thingamabob. And so he doesn't know that Larry's son would then take up the mantle of Larryboy passed on from his father. And this even makes more sense because as the more technology builds and builds and builds, you then get the utility belt and the cape and all of that Larry uses in the cartoon adventures of Larryboy that does not get used in the other episodes. Thus, that completes the timeline of Larryboy. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys really enjoyed this whole series. It was a ton of fun to do. The next series we're going to be covering will be the evolution of VeggieTales. How VeggieTales started as a very simple show ran by a group of friends to then how it evolved into where we see it at the end with Beauty and the Beat. We'll be tracing through the evolution, the growths of the show within a show kind of mentality throughout every single episode. So this is going to be a really long series, and I hope you guys stick along with it. If you have any other theories or any things you want to talk about in regards to this theory series, please let me know. There will be a link to the Discord down below. You can also leave a comment. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.
Dance with me, Lampy!